Are lights and sirens why you got into EMS? Are they an essential life-saving intervention, or should we ban them as, I don't know, dangerous tools of mass destruction? Why are you hearing all this talk nationally about prying your federal siren from your cold, dead fingers? All right, I'm a Texan, I'm a little prone to exaggeration, but is that really what's going on here? Or is there a more nuanced discussion taking place these days? Join us after the break and find out.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
This is the first quality improvement effort that's ever been undertaken on a national scale, and we're specifically talking about reducing the use of lights and sirens. We have guests that include the authors of these papers and the leaders of this quality improvement initiative. We have some great interviews with Doug Kupas, Lawrence Brown, Michael Redlenner, and Mike Taigman. Before we get to these interviews, I want to thank Williamson County EMS for producing this episode. This is a lot of work. I had a lot of different videos and a lot of interviews, and I just wasn't able to put them all together and pull this off on my own. Our system EMS director, Mike Knipstein, he understands the importance of this issue, and he was willing to support us getting more information out about it. And my colleague at Wilco, Dan Cohen, he has done an amazing job editing all of these various videos and putting them together into something that I think really helps advance this discussion of EMS safety. My thanks to Wilco EMS and specifically Dan Cohen for their incredible support. So let's start off with the discussion of a 1994 paper on this subject by Dr. Doug Kupas. Dr. Kupas has long been a leader on this issue. In addition to writing this paper that we're about to discuss, he is also the author of a NHTSA-funded white paper on the use of lights and sirens, and he is also the lead author of the recent position statement on using lights and sirens, or as he said, lights and siren. He's an EMS and emergency physician in Pennsylvania. He's a professor of emergency medicine at Temple University. He is also the state medical director, the Commonwealth Medical Director of Pennsylvania, and the medical director for the Geisinger EMS system in Danville. He is a board member of the National Association of EMS Physicians, and he is the medical director for the National Association of EMTs.
Well, Dr. Jarvis, it is great to be able to join you to talk about lights and siren, and it's hard to believe that was 1994, almost 30 years ago. The research to that was done essentially 30 years ago. In some ways, we have seen little improvements in the safe use of lights and siren over that 30 years, but I'm really pleased by how much attention this topic is getting now. It's on multiple fronts. There are several big things going on right now that have brought this to the forefront, and it really, I think, is set up to have more of an impact than many other things that have had little impacts over that 30 years, but haven't really dramatically changed the lights and siren use. I think we're set up for that right now. As many emergency medicine residents, when I was in residency in the early 1990s, there was a requirement to do scholarly activity. And the idea was that essentially means you did research, and the expectation was that you also got that research published. What led to my first publication was this residency requirement to do research, and I picked lights and siren. I had a background of being an EMT and paramedic through high school and college, And I also had a background with working with two very different EMS agencies. One was doing essentially what everybody did at the time back then. You got a 911 call, you went to all of them with lights and siren. You picked your patient up and you took them all to the hospital with lights and siren. And I can remember as a 16-year-old EMT questioning some more senior EMTs about whether, some of those patients that we transported really needed a lights and siren transport. One in particular that sticks in mind was a direct admission when we got to the hospital. The other agency that I worked with already was having EMTs screen every call at dispatch, and they were going to only about 70% of their calls with lights and siren. And at the time I was doing that, this is now almost 40 years ago, they were transporting very few to the hospital with lights and sirens. So this concept and the safety of it and the concerns for risk were in my mind at that time. And I decided to work with one of those agencies, and we used a medical protocol to essentially try to limit lights and siren transport. And the medical protocol, I would not suggest that anybody goes to that 1994 article and pull that protocol and say, this is going to be our transport with lights and siren protocol. 30 years ago, things were very different. I would not write the same things. Many of the things in that protocol right now, today, I would say, no, you don't need lights and siren for that. It really did limit it down to 8% of the transports. So the agency that we did this was sort of a suburban agency, suburban and rural at the outskirts, covered an entire county in western Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh. We followed over a couple months 1,625 911 calls with transport to the hospital. And the crews documented whether they transported with or without lights and siren. They also, at the time, on the not NEMSQA, because NEMSQA didn't exist then, but the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had about 104, 109 data points that were being collected by agencies. They had a set of data points that were collected related to how the patient did during your care. Did they worsen? Did they stay the same? Did they improve, or did they die? To further ensure that the EMS clinicians didn't think that the patient worsened, but maybe they got to the hospital and the emergency physician thought, oh, they missed the boat here and this patient was really critical. We actually had a form that was completed by the receiving emergency physician, and that was linked up with the patient care reports and the documentation from the providers, and the selection of which criteria they used on the protocol. So when all was said and done, they transported, out of 1,625 patients in the study, they transported 130 with lights and siren. Patients that were transported without lights and siren, we looked very carefully for any evidence of worsened condition. Did they die on arriving at the emergency department? Did the emergency physician feel that they were critical and should have been brought in as quicker? Keep in mind that at the time we did this, we didn't even know, the literature hadn't been done that shows how much time is saved with lights and siren. But it was this subjective, should they have gotten there quicker? Did they have a critical issue going on? And so we looked at that. There was a dramatic difference in the patients that died and that worsened. Almost all of those were in the category side of transport with lights and siren. The vast majority of the ones that were transported without lights and siren either improved or had no change in their status. But if they did worsen, none of them died, but if they did worsen, when we followed it up on the emergency physician side, they weren't felt to have been had something critical that they should have gotten to the ED faster. I guess the other thing that I will point out is that when you look at the criteria, most of those criteria were almost like the first part of our, trauma triage criteria that people are used to. They were physiologic and anatomic. So they were pointing out things like hypotension or an altered Glasgow coma score. There was one final potential catch-all or relief valve if somebody looked sick and they didn't meet any of the other criteria. And that final one was for EMS clinician judgment. And that one was used in a fair number of the responses. I would say that these days, agencies that have a good culture about the risks and benefits and how often they use lights and siren during transport probably have clinicians that would have looked at some of the patients that back then were viewed to be, oh, maybe they're unstable and I should use lights and siren. Now we do a lot more for our patients. We offer a lot more to our patients. The study I did in 94 was before CPAP and before the advent of like AEDs, and also there's so much has changed. And, EMTs are now doing largely, many of the things that the paramedics were doing back then. So care has changed dramatically, and I think that the 8% could be viewed as high by some agencies' standards these days. For that time, it was pretty amazing to do 8% lights and siren transport and 92% transport without lights and siren.
So I love this study. I think it, especially taken in the context of the time and the way we were transporting people and responding, I think it was really important work. There are a couple of things just to make sure I understand it. You implemented a protocol that says these are the times and the only times you should go lights and sirens. Some physiologic, some anatomic criteria, and clinician gestalt. You think you need it. And what you found is with that protocol, only 8% of the time did patients go lights and sirens. And then the thing I love is you had a balancing measure here to look at, of those patients that went without lights and sirens, did the emergency physician think anything that was missed that would have benefited from lights and sirens? And they did not. It was safe to do this. Is that a safe summation there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that summarizes it very nicely.
One thing, you have a table in here listing the patients that the medic felt decompensated or got worse during transport. And again, in the 30-year-old retrospectoscope, things that I think most medics now would feel very comfortable with. A 63-year-old who had a seizure that was adequately treated with benzos. A 56-year-old who had a little bit of hematemesis after coughing, remained stable. I think most of us would look at that and go, of course, I'm not going to go light and siren. So this is outstanding work. Thank you so much for this. And thank you again for the work you're doing. And as a matter of fact, you're doing so much. We're going to come back to you later in this episode and talk about a position statement that you authored. Dr. Kupas, thank you, sir.
Sounds good. You're welcome.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.